Turkish Airlines presents Business Africa.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Business Africa. I'm Dayoka, the top stories of the edition. Sub-Saharan Africa is facing a major shortage of funding that threatens the region's growth, the International Monetary Fund warned in a report on the region's economic outlook. Amid this slowdown, Senegal recorded an inflation of 9.7% in 2022. The situation is getting unbearable for most Senegalese households as religious holidays approach. And finally, Libyan date producers would like to export their abundant harvests, but they are faced with various challenges that hinder their hopes for emancipation. In sub-Saharan Africa, persistent global inflation and tighter monetary policies have led to higher borrowing costs, the IMF said in its latest report. The organization also warns that public debt is further delaying the region's economic recovery.
The International Monetary Fund's Economic Outlook report for Sub-Saharan Africa paints a bleak picture for the region. For the second year in a row, Sub-Saharan Africa is recording a lower growth rate than the previous year. Growth is expected to fall to 3.6% this year, according to the IMF, before rebounding to 4.2% in 2024. Inflation and public debt are at levels not seen in decades, with half the countries in the region experiencing inflation above 10%, the study noted. Public debt reached 56% of GDP at the end of 2022. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the highest level since the early 2000s. For the Washington-based organization, several problems have come together, from rising borrowing costs to strong pressures on exchange rate to the drying up of international aid. But the IMF said the region was not defenseless and recommended that government take 4 steps to mitigate the damage: shore up public finances and avoid excessive spending, keep inflation under control, allow exchange rates to adjust, and ensure that major efforts to combat climate change do not crowd out financing for basic needs such as health and education.
Catherine Patillo, the Deputy Director of the International Monetary Fund's African Department, is our guest this week. Welcome to Business Africa.
Good morning.
In the IMF report, we could observe that the inflationary trend is mainly driven by external factors. How can governments adapt their monetary policy to isolate the economies from the external environment?
What we're seeing now is that in around half the economies in sub-Saharan Africa, inflation has peaked. But that means in the other half, inflation is still rising. So what policymakers need to do is to stay the course, that monetary policy needs to continue to be cautiously tightening in order to make sure that inflation is firmly on a downward path and that it's on track then to go back to target range.
By late 2022, public debt in sub-Saharan Africa reached 56% of GDP, the highest since the early 2000s, according to the IMF. Yet, G20 member countries elaborated in 2020 a common framework for debt treatments. What's delayed this initiative?
The G20 common framework is really a welcome new process that was introduced. Previously, we had only the Paris Club, and now the creditor landscape has changed so much that this has brought together both the traditional as well as the newer creditors. But the issues that then are needed to help confront debt restructuring for the countries that have gotten to that critical point those issues are quite complex. And I think we are making progress. There have been positive now discussions in the case of Zambia, and we're hoping to see progress soon.
Various calls for debt restructuring were made by developing countries at the recently concluded World Bank and IMF spring meetings. An agreement was allegedly reached. Could you tell us more about this?
So this is the progress that has been made in the context of the Global Debt Sovereign Roundtable. What came out of the meeting was a lot of progress on this common understanding of the need for greater information sharing between the international financial institutions and the creditors, as well as an improved understanding of the role of the multilateral development banks and the World Bank, and the importance of providing net positive inflows on a concessional basis during the process.
I would like us to end this conversation on energy transition. It's driving a demand for metals and minerals on the continent. Resource-rich countries could take advantage of this. What are the IMF's recommendations in this regard?
So there is the opportunity now to look to benefit from what will be increased demand for these materials. And what we are hearing from countries is the importance then of countries being able to address the impacts of climate change with support of climate finance, because countries in Africa are the countries that have contributed the least to climate change, but are some of the most vulnerable.
Madam Catherine Patillo, thank you for your insight.
Thank you. My pleasure.
If the Tabaski holiday, which marks the end of Ramadan, is synonymous with festivities for children, it's quite another matter for parents. Most Senegalese households came to the same conclusion this year. Adults would have to tighten their belts. Senegal grapples with a worrying inflation rate, while the country's economy experiences a sharper than expected slowdown, according to IMF forecasts. Inflation has reached 9.7% in 2022, its highest level in decades. The situation partly stems from soaring food prices. The increase has gotten unbearable for most Senegalese households, especially during the holiday season. It is very difficult. It would be really nice if prices were lowered, because everything has become expensive. A kilo of potatoes costs between 400 and 500 francs, and onions cost 500 francs. On top of that, you have to spend money on the children's clothes, their bread and so on. Observing this market of the capital a few days before Eid gives a clue to the economic outlook. It would usually be the holiday rush merged to the satisfaction of traders. However, many, like this new mother, have to calculate their spending down to the last penny. It's only getting worse. Adults can adapt, but it is not the case for children. So we are forced to make sacrifices, to come to the market and try to satisfy the kids. It's very difficult for everyone. Even traders complain.
We are at a standstill. We suffered from the coronavirus. People have no money. If you import a lot of products, it takes time to sell everything.
Faced with difficulties, Senegalese no longer know which economy to trust, even though the IMF projects inflation will drop at 5% in 2023. It's not enough to calm the anxiety. The Libyan regions of Wahat and Aoudjila are renowned for producing large quantities of dates, up to 150,000 tons per year. The problem is that much of this fruit is destroyed or used as fodder due to low marketing.
In Libya, date production is flourishing, but still very slow to reach the market. In the fertile Wahat region, there are about 2 million palm trees on some 5,000 farms. Producers who say they produce too many dates would like to export some of their produce, not only to generate profits, but also to avoid waste. Ibrahim Behairi is the owner of a date farm in Aoudjila, a town in the northeast of the country. Like his colleagues, he advocates for better regulations to counter this difficult situation. We want to be able to market the dates outside Libya. If the market opens up so we can export and the state puts down laws and regulations, the farmers will be motivated to produce more dates. That will support the state's economy. The Augil Association for Agriculture, which has been helping farmers for decades with various services, highlights other problems facing date growers that include lack of access to equipment. The association brings in these pesticides, fertilizers and equipment from markets and factories in Libya, as well as factories in neighboring countries. But the association should be supported by the state through bank credits that will make it possible to get these materials at reasonable prices. Libya is heavily dependent on its oil, and the export of dates could help diversify its economy. Like Algeria and neighboring Tunisia, subsidies have allowed producers to increase their yields. In 2020, date production in Tunisia brought in a total of $180 million, according to the Tunisia Observatory of Agriculture.
That does it for this episode of Business Africa. More news up next on Africanews and on all our platforms. See you soon.
Business Africa was presented by Turkish Airlines.